Welcome to episode 13 of the Douglas Social Credit Podcast. My name is Dr. Oliver Heydorn, and I'm joined once again by my colleague, William Waite. And today we thought that we would discuss uh, something called the profit regulation condition, which Douglas sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes spoke about in connection with the compensated price discount. So the basic idea was that if we're going to have a discount in place, in keeping with the consumption production ratio, and retailers will be lowering their prices. At least this is one of the mechanisms. It's not the only one, but the retailer could lower the price by the discount percentage. And then the National Credit Authority would reimburse the retailer to the extent that he was out of pocket. And as a condition of participating in this program, Douglas sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes he says, well, the business or the industry to which the business belongs would have to negotiate with the National Credit Authority on a particular profit margin on turnover. So it could be 5%, it could be 10%. Why? Because there was some fear that if we start injecting debt-free credit in the form of a discount and a dividend, that some businesses that are in a position to take advantage of that could profiteer. They could raise their prices, and this actually then would cause inflation and would have the opposite effect of what's intended, because what we intend by this is to increase consumer buying power. And if prices are going up, then we're not increasing consumer buying power. It's being eaten away through inflation. So Douglas thought perhaps that this might be necessary. It's not clear whether this was a transitional thing, whether he thought it was absolutely necessary in every case, but it was one tool in his toolkit that he was willing to put forward in the event that unintended demand pull inflation occurred as a result of injecting this debt-free credit to fill the price income gap. So what the first thing I probably want to say is that this is not a central issue in Douglas social credit. This is, you could think of it as a secondary matter or even a tertiary matter. I say that because it doesn't receive a lot of attention in Douglas's works. Right? If you look at his books, his articles, his speeches, he'll talk in many cases at great lengths about the compensated price discount, about two different models that he had, because the retailer could lower it and the retailer could be reimbursed, but you could also have the consumer pay full price and have the National Credit Office reimburse the consumer to the extent of the discount. So he
Mhm.
talks quite a lot about this in his various works, and but he doesn't always mention the profit regulation condition. It's only mentioned, for example, in the draft scheme for Scotland is one example. I think in two or three other places he talks about it when he's thinking in terms of the practicalities of implementation. But no one should think that this is somehow a linchpin of Douglas social credit, or that they have to agree with this, otherwise they can't agree with anything else. It's not that centrally important as far as the presentation of the doctrine is concerned. And we'll probably talk about it, but there are many other ways, perhaps more effective ways, more efficient ways that this threat of demand pull inflation could be dealt with, besides um, trying to come to some agreement so that there's a regulated profit margin on turnover.
You've talked to people more about this than I have. What are the what are the objections to this initiative that often come up?
So some people don't like the idea of the government regulating profit margins because they think that it would interfere with incentives, investment incentives, efficiency incentives, um, because, according to theory anyway, if a business is able to make windfall profits, then that's acts as a market signal, and it encourages other businesses to start up or to move into that particular field in order to compete so that they can get in on some of the action, the result of which would be eventually, the lowering of price to a saner level. So they're concerned that it could interfere with that
So
stream.
in that case, in the case of windfall profits, as my understanding is that participation in the scheme would be voluntary.
Yes,
So a company who anticipated windfall profits, they would be free to opt out of the discount?
they would. They would. The only thing there, of course, as we were talking about before we went live, is that if that company doesn't have a monopoly or is not part of an oligopoly, which of course are not good things to begin with, uh, presumably they would have competitors. And so if they're not willing to sell um, at the discounted rate with the profit regulation in play, then they would be at a disadvantage to those who would say, yes, we'll agree to that. Um,
Mm,
One of the responses to this concern is, well, companies can still make profits, they can still increase their profits, they just would have to increase it by selling more, by increasing their volume, either increasing market share, which could cause its own problems, or all the companies in a particular industry would just sell more to the economy, period, because there's more demand for whatever it is that they
mm,
sell. And so if they increase their volume, then their aggregate profits would be larger. So there's still a profit incentive to respond to consumer demand. But it's more of like a quantity based incentive rather than just a profit margin incentive.
I know one argument would be that, you know, the our best and brightest are chasing mega profits.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose this is a um, this would not allow mega profits to be made. Only only larger profits on the basis of increased turnover.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that could
Um,
be, and that touches on something else that we were talking about before we went live as well. And that is, we're coming out of 30, 40 years of neoliberalism within the context of a dishonest, dysfunctional, power and wealth centralizing financial system that puts a lot of pressure on people to survive. And there's a tremendous amount of debt, and it's hard to get jobs, and there's all this pressure. And so, under those circumstances, it's understandable that people are incentivized to make as much money as possible, however they can. And it
mm,
might be the case that when Douglas thought this up, the culture was different, the economic climate was different. You could reasonably expect people to be satisfied, perhaps, with a certain reasonable margin on profit, and people weren't trying to game the system or profiteer or get as much as they can while they can, because it wasn't a dog eat dog environment to the extent that in certain respects it's become.
mm. I think that's certainly true. Although wasn't Adam Smith's vile maxim all for me and nothing for anyone else, or something like that? So it certainly was. It certainly, this dog eat dog thing was certainly a factor, even back
Yes.
back in those days. Mm,
Yes. Well, I mean, it's a legitimate question because I think when Adam Smith was alive and, during the 19th century, I think things had become pretty radical as far as the economic liberalism was concerned. But Douglas, of course, is writing in the 1920s and 1930s. I think things have been pulled back a bit by
mm.
that stage. Um, but I mean, these are interesting. I mean, obviously, we can't ask Douglas, which is a pity because it would be very interesting to, kind of figure out what was going through his mind and why he thought this was necessary. And, you know, he obviously thought if it did cause problems, maybe it would be worth it. Uh, the profit regulation condition, of course, was only to apply to retail businesses selling to the
Mm.
consumer, not to all businesses, period. And apart from any theory, a variation of this actually was in place in Australia during the Second World War in order to keep inflation down during the reign of the Curtin government. Maybe you could tell us about that.
Yeah, so at the outbreak of the Second World War, conditions were ripe for inflation. You had a lot of production, obviously going to the war, and there was a bit of a dearth on consumer products. As well as that, you had a lot of men enlisting in the military, and then women coming in to fill their place in the factories and so on. So you had happening at the same time. There was a drop in production, but there was also a lot of money in terms of wages being distributed to especially women who hadn't been in the workforce before. So the other worry of the government was that, of course, there would be enormous demand for energy and steel and everything required to run a war, which is basically everything, and that people would, clock on to the increased demand and just raise prices. So there was a lot of inflationary pressure at the time. Curtin realised that the the household was in line to suffer a lot from this inflation, and he reduced what can only be described as price controls. One of them was one of these control mechanisms was actually they'd set a ceiling on prices. So they chose a date and
Mm,
they said prices are not to increase beyond what your prices are from this date.
mm,
Um, they also introduced consumer price discounts, so subsidies to producers and retailers.
mm.
Um, but they applied these to only a limited number of items. So the idea of the whole scheme was to make sure that cost of living remained affordable,
Mhm.
during this period of inflationary pressure. And they applied these controls to a limited number of items. So there was um, potatoes was one, tea, sugar, meat,
Mm.
clothing, fuel, and I think electricity was on the list as well. There were others. And the idea was that they could use these price control mechanisms to reduce the cost of living at a time of inflationary pressure. And the interesting thing was that it worked.
It did work.
So even in this, the yearbook is at 1937 yearbook, I think.
No, I think it's volume 37, but the yearbook itself, I think, is from uh,
It must be after.
40s.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yes, of
it's
course.
after the war. Yeah.
Um, it showed that despite the difficult conditions, inflation was actually controlled and came back a little bit over the years that the scheme was in place.
Mhm.
So I suppose this is a real world example of what we're talking about. Of course, it would be. I mean, it was something of emergency conditions at those times, and
Mhm.
it could be introduced I suppose, in a more measured and perhaps gradual way. And but but it's been done before, and it could be done again.
Yeah.
Um,
The two things we should add there too is that, as I understand it, this whole idea was inspired by Douglas. Douglas social
mm,
credit, had some currency in Australia during the 1930s, the Depression, and his ideas were being disseminated. There were journals and study groups and newspapers and people advocating for it. And this is one of the sources of inspiration that the Curtin government sort of latched onto. The other thing, too, is that unfortunately it was funded purely within the context of the existing economic orthodoxy. So there was no
yes.
creation of debt-free credit to pay the reimbursement. It was just the same old redistributive taxation and or increase in public debts.
But I think the lesson here though is that credit can be credit can be used in order to bring prices down. You know, the big trouble that we have is we need to increase purchasing power. But how do you do that in such a way as it doesn't chase prices up?
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, and social creditors have been, you know, we've been accused of being inflationary, and I suppose that's the big technical objection, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But perhaps, you know, it's useful to note that the conventional system has never managed to control inflation itself.
No.
You know, we're constantly suffering from the erosion of our purchasing power, and unless you unless you give some attention to prices,
Mm-hmm.
you can't create you can't create credit and not expect them to go up.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's fair to say.
Yeah. The other thing is that, of course, we would say that the primary driver of inflation in any case is it takes the form of cost push inflation. It has to do with the fact that we run a debt only monetary system,
Mm.
which tries to fill the recurring gap with more and more debt money. And of course, those debts have to be serviced. And so as time goes on, as the debt burden increases and the servicing charges increase, it becomes harder and harder to buy what you used to buy and at the same time service your growing debts. So then you ask for wage and salary increases, but those eventually filter through in the form of increased prices. So it creates this wage price
Yeah.
spiral. And we would say that that's the primary driver of inflation, the last 100 years. Uh, but the other thing I should mention too is that there are, of course, social creditors who do not believe that the profit regulation condition is even necessary. So some think that if you can have enough competition, retailers are competing with each other, then
Mm.
you can rely on market conditions to be self-regulating. And although you're adding, debt-free credit into the system in the form of a dividend and a discount, as long as there's sufficient competition, retailers won't be in a position to profiteer,
Yeah.
right? And if that's the case, if that's true, I think even Douglas himself would say that that would be preferable to having to have to regulate profit margins and
Yes.
turnover. Like we want the least amount of government intervention necessary to get the job done.
Yes. Yeah, and one of the objections too, of course, is the administrative burden and the compliance, you
Mm.
know, making sure that everyone's following the rules and isn't gaming the system. And we were talking about this before. It seems like everybody now feels like gaming the system is just part of ordinary business.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and you'd have to whatever you did, you'd have to expect there'd be not a majority necessarily, but a minority that would try and do that,
Mm-hmm.
and that'd have to be discouraged.
Yes. Yes. Of course, at the same time, we would hope that if we change the whole economic environment and we create conditions where people are more secure and they don't have all this financial pressure and they don't have all this debt, then the incentive to cheat would also tend to atrophy,
Hmm.
or the
I
pressure to.
think that's true, especially if you could reduce the debt burden, um, and if you reduce the debt burden on the national debt, you could foreseeably reduce taxation.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, under Douglas social credit system, that taxation would come back anyway. It would atrophy, I suppose,
Yeah,
ideally.
we should do a whole episode about taxation and how we would anticipate that taxes would actually be significantly reduced as well as a
Mm,
result of the Douglas social credit measures. Um, because there's a lot that can be said on that. But one thing that I did mention in an article that I wrote quite recently on this subject is that in some cases, the profit regulation condition may actually work in favor of a business or certain types of businesses, because I think it's a bit different in Australia, but in Canada, apparently the typical grocery store, supermarket store only makes about 1% or 2% profit on turnover. So profit margins are very, very small. And theoretically, the National Credit Authority could say, look, you do some very important work, providing food for the nation, distributing food for the nation. Your profit margins should be healthier than that. Let's put a 5% profit margin
Mm,
turnover. And they actually would be better off. So some businesses would be better off, undoubtedly.
sure. Yeah.
So, um, but then you have the question of equity between different industries, and some people have pointed out as well that, well, how do you determine what falls in an industry? It's the lines can be blurred sometimes. Walmart, for example, functions as a supermarket. They sell food, but they also sell electronics and clothes and so many other things. So would you have one profit margin on the food items and another profit margin on the clothes, depending on who they're competing with in that particular market?
Mm,
I don't think any of these things are insurmountable, especially not now with the kind of computers and telecommunications technology that we've got. It should be easier now than ever before if we wanted to do that. I mean, if you think about just the income tax system, how complicated that is,
mm.
and all the social programs that the government runs and things like that. Uh, but yeah, there is that question of what constitutes an industry, what falls in what industry, and can you get all the members, all the companies in an industry to agree on what the reasonable profit margin should be?
Mm,
So there is a certain amount of complication there that would be avoided if you could rely on something else to self-regulate, so that you didn't have that.
Is there an option for reducing the complexity by applying it only to a limited number of a number of sectors in the economy?
Hmm.
Is that a reasonable suggestion? Like in the curtain example, for instance, the idea was to bring down cost of living for households. Well, households, I mean, households buy all sorts of things, but the essentials, the non-discretionary items in households are fairly limited.
Hmm.
And in this country, at least, they're in terms of market share, they're very concentrated as well, which seems to me to be an opportunity that would make compliance simpler. But if you did it just for a limited range of in a limited range of sectors
Hmm.
that provided things to the whole community. Like I'm thinking about energy, fuel and electricity, fresh food, and maybe there are a couple of others. Because the complication of trying to regulate every industry
Hmm.
is significant.
Well, every industry that sells to the consumer, yeah, every retail.
Sure, yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean that's something that would have to be looked at. People have also suggested, well, maybe you could have progressive taxation. If a company profiteers above a certain level, then it's 30%, then it's 50% tax rate, or then it's
Yeah.
60%. So you sort of discourage them from going overboard. Uh,
Mm,
Antitrust laws and the enforcement of antitrust laws could also be used to ensure that there's sufficient competition. That's another alternative. But I think
yeah, yeah.
the bottom line is we don't want a situation where we're creating debt-free credit. There's demand pull inflation, and some of the goods and services that are being produced are not selling because there isn't money to buy them. And some of the people who need the goods and services aren't getting them because they don't have the money to buy them. Not because the money wasn't created, but because certain people in certain sectors have mopped it up.
Mm.
And then the question is, well, should the National Credit Authority create even more money to replace what's been mopped up? But then, it can become like a positive feedback loop.
Yeah.
And then you
Mm.
you end up with the huge objection, of course, that some people used to make and would still make, that, oh, it's inflationary. And, of course, we never said that you should create money willy-nilly. It was always supposed to be carefully calculated to fill the gap and not a penny more. But when the gap is
Yes.
a moving target, then how do you how do you
Yeah.
equate those two things?
Maybe safe to undershoot it.
Hmm. Then yeah, err on the side of caution.
Yeah.
So anyway, I wrote an article on this, and anyone who's interested in the ins and outs can check it out. I personally would say, following Douglas, do what works best in practice. That's what Douglas would say, that we're not ideological about this. It's not like we have to hold it for some principled reason. It's just a question of what is going to give us the results that we're looking for, which is an increase of purchasing power in favor of the consumer. And at the same time, of course, that necessitates that we're not inducing demand pull inflation.
Yes.
So
I
whatever.
think the tools are there, and it would probably require some careful experimentation, especially at the beginning, to see what was happening, how it affected the markets and so on.
Right.
And we'd have to keep a close eye on prices, and hopefully we could come to some happy medium.
But as we say, we know the profit regulation condition. It may not be perfect. There might be some problems that it creates regarding incentives, but it actually did work in Australia. Like it has been used, and
Yes.
so it's not impossible. Whether it's the best instrument, the best tool for that outcome is another question. But we know at least it can work,
Mm.
and the sky didn't fall.
And we are trying to solve a pretty sticky problem here too.
Hmm.
Like inflation, the erosion of purchasing power by inflation has dogged all economies at all monetary economies at all times, as far as I'm aware.
Well, apparently there were periods, let's say in English history, where for very long periods of time there were no inflation. There was no inflation. In the period when they were using tally sticks and things like this, that prices apparently were relatively constant over long periods of time.
Yeah, okay.
So, it's certainly a feature of the debt-based money system we have now for
Mm.
reasons that we already discussed. But and we're anti-inflation. We don't want inflation. Inflation's not a good thing. Um, it shouldn't be there because it's a destabilizing force in the economy. And actually, it doesn't reflect reality. As technology advances, things should be getting cheaper, and the purchasing power of every unit of currency should be steadily increasing as physical processes become more and more efficient
Mm.
alongside technological advance. So, uh, if that's the physical reality, and if the financial system should reflect the physical reality, well, if it's becoming cheaper to live in physical terms, it should be becoming cheaper to live in financial terms also.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Well, I think we're running out of time again.
Yeah.
Our website, our websites are socred.org and thepeoplescredit.com.au. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.